everybody. I've got Josh with me today, and we are going to be talking about intelligent automation and digital transformation within the life sciences space. But before we get into the questions that I have for you, would you mind giving everybody an introduction?
Hey, everybody. Josh Noble. I've worked with Blue Prism for about 5 years or so at this point. The majority of the work that we've done across fairly highly regulated industries, healthcare, life sciences, the pharma space, been involved with for that for years. In fact, I've had a chance here to work with, I think, about 60% of all pharmaceutical companies over $10 billion in revenue. So learned a few lessons on that side from the compliance regulatory side of things from healthcare and life sciences, and hopefully can share a little bit here on Emma's podcast.
Perfect. That's what we're going to dig into. But to get us started, I just kind of want to level set with the idea of, as we talk about digital transformation and intelligent automation, from your perspective, where is the value coming from for life sciences companies to look at investing in these types of technologies?
Yeah, so of course, the easy place that everybody starts is still applicable to the life sciences space. So we look at shared services historically, finance, HR, generally into IT. But if you want to get a little more narrowed into, say, the life sciences area, we can look at, say, merger and acquisitions. There's a ton of work that goes into mergers and acquisitions. It's how a lot of pharmaceutical and life sciences companies grow. And if we look at, say, just rules-driven repetitive automation like RPA alone, we can get into a lot of, say, one-time transition work where maybe it doesn't make sense to hook together deeply two different systems. One-time transition work, offer letter generation, rekeying of data from payroll systems. Last year, I was involved with a learning management system migration that involved porting records from 30,000 employees to a new system. And that manually would take a lot of time. There's a lot of checks that need to go in place to make sure that's accurate, but building back-end integrations maybe not the right way to historically go about that. We're seeing companies that are deploying intelligent automation across a whole lot of different departments. And as they build up those objects or those reusable Lego blocks, they can start to string together processes that bring together many different departments, even again on the rules-driven side. So, for example, taxable asset tracking. So if anybody's a U.S. citizen involved with a clinical trial, well, we might as well go find out all the assets that are related to that person and the potential tax write-offs. But that involves multiple different departments. And then as we move up kind of the cognitive scale, we can get into things, for example, in the legal area, where you're pairing RPA plus natural language processing to look for, say, contract terms that need to be renegotiated. If we look at, say, larger pharmaceuticals and biotechs, I mentioned they tend to grow a lot through merger and acquisition, and that involves a ton of just rekeying where people are acting like human photocopiers for a good portion of the day. So when a company acquires another company, they're also acquiring their various different systems and their data that comes with it. And so you've got two choices at that point if you're the acquiring company. You can merge all of that data into your systems, or you can have both systems running in parallel. And the burden of that historically is generally landed on IT, and IT is generally already overloaded before that type of activity occurs. So integration of two companies ends up taking a couple years. It's a big problem, particularly in, again, the life sciences space where you see all that integration going on all the time. So nowadays we have these no-code or low-code intelligent automation solutions that can be governed by IT. IT is definitely still involved, very, very critical. IT must be involved with this. Please don't go about that route. But they can be governed by IT, but owned by the business, so that you can then glue together these various different systems, or say even map that one-time transition without getting into heavy coding IT historical resources. The other big area to keep in mind, aside from the straightforward data movement, data parsing, gluing together these systems, is that unlike, say, other industries where, say, insurance area may look at Savings being around work reduction, reducing the number of hours required to go through a particular piece of work, saving time. Life sciences companies tend to value a bit more towards higher volume and consistent. So doing work right the first time, eliminating human error and checking for human errors tends to be a higher value there than, say, just the body count and type of work. So that also feeds into compliance. But I think you had another question on compliance.
You fed into it perfectly, because that's going to be the next question, and I started smirking over here because I was like, oh, he's doing my job. Can you tell he's a pro? So when we look at compliance, you mentioned this idea that we're looking as that value being brought forward by intelligent automation is doing work right the first time without human error. So let's talk a little bit more about this idea of how intelligent automation can support compliance within life sciences companies.
All right. So, I just mentioned accuracy a second ago, but if we remember back from, say, basic stats class, we probably remember that, in general, a larger sample size, more data is generally a good thing. But for companies, that's only a good thing if you can do something with it, if you can make any sense of it. And so on the compliance side, intelligent automation, even down to straightforward software robots, can collect data from all sorts of different systems, aggregate that data together. And where that becomes beneficial is, let's say you need to review communications. You can scan through emails, chats, IVR transcripts, and potentially flag for adverse events, things that maybe a human didn't notice in those communications, but a software robot that can dig through those meticulously can. Then once you've aggregated that data together, you can apply something like Data Robot to potentially identify patterns between that data. Now, where that becomes very tricky is the flip side of that. Aggregating data, collecting data can be a very good thing. Where the rules get a little weird is doing something with that data, especially externally. So, for example, turning around without human intervention and filing an individual case study report maybe might not be the safest thing today. And the reason is because that starts to bring in things like natural language processing, and various different cognitive solutions like that get into factoring in probabilities versus just very, very defined rules. And the industry, at least in life sciences, is still a little unclear as to the regulations and the rules of how those probabilities can be used. If you check back, I did a webinar with AbbVie, PPD, and J&J back in July of, I guess it's 2020 at this point, and they talked about their experience with this, provide a bit of knowledge, and those industry groups can be really powerful because just because the FDA, for example, doesn't have exact rules, the industry bodies as a whole, various different companies can come together to form that point of view, and they talk about GXP versus non-GXP compliant processes and how they handle that. And also keep in mind that not all systems are friendly to intelligent automation. I mean, if you think about maybe the most newsworthy point on that, as it's outside of the life sciences area, but think about the U.S. Small Business Administration issues around the PPP loans this past year. The government went so far as to blame robotic process automation for overwhelming their website. And despite your opinions on this kind of scapegoat excuse, it did trigger the U.S. government to open up APIs to access for smaller financial institutions and level the playing field. So even though RPA wasn't necessarily the right solution for submissions, it did have a positive benefit overall by level the playing field. And in the life sciences space, Vigilance over in Europe went through a similar thing. Maybe a little less newsworthy, but Vigilance is the system that handles electronic submissions for pharmacovigilance information. So if you're doing clinical trials in Europe, or you're, say, marketing medicinal products for investigational applications, you need to file that through Vigilance. And a few years back, Vigilance was only providing 5 logins to companies. So big companies had to be extremely efficient with how they were using those logins to this government site. Nowadays, Vigilance provides the option for EDI uploads, but that requires a life sciences company to ensure that their local safety pharmacovigilance database is compliant with Vigilance's messaging format, their terminology, their database structure. There's a lot of testing that goes involved with making that work. And just like the US SBA E-Trans system for PPP loans, Vigilance may not be real happy with companies hammering their platform through user interfaces. So even if you, however, can't do the final filing through user interface, say through RPA against Vigilance, and you're taking that EDI upload approach, there's still a lot that has to go on within your walls before you do that upload. So there's a lot of data aggregation, manipulation of data, verification of steps that go in before you're submitting to those portals. And keep in mind, one of the benefits of intelligent automation versus, again, your historical kind of EDI uploads is the amount of logging that can go in. You can track every single step that's gone into your processes and report out on that versus just saying, we're firing off this bulk file. Intelligent automation can also do the QA testing that's involved with making sure your database and terminology and everything there is going to match up with Vigilance. So benefit there. One other area or I guess two other areas to mention around compliance. One is that you can use intelligent automation to keep ahead of constantly changing regulations. So for example, drug labels. Those change all the time. The requirements year to year from every government agency in the world tends to change. And so you can use intelligent automation to actually update your drug label artwork, again, around the globe. And that's particularly important when you're talking about smaller companies that need to operate in many, many different geographies, many different countries and sanctions. And then finally, tangential to compliance, we get into the security side of things. Talking about life sciences companies that are doing clinical trials, that are dealing with healthcare information. So confidentiality, PII, PHI, data protection is key here. And every human that's seeing or touching healthcare data adds risks. About a decade and a half ago, I worked at an ER, and I can tell you that there were plenty of nights at 3 a.m. that we were laughing about, scans that we were seeing, medical scans that we could access that were from weird things. And there was a lot of water cooler talk that occurred that probably wouldn't be kosher nowadays. But even though not malicious, that could be a problem that you're having humans being able to see that information. And it has led to unintentional data leaks through, say, BPO organizations. That's the type of thing that if all we're doing is feeding that information through software robots without a human looking at those screens, that can be beneficial. And finally, on that point, that's where the aspect of citizen developer kind of topics and this going back to the days of macros for everybody and everybody automating their own things can start to get a little bit iffy when we get into life sciences companies, because while vendors are selling that as quick and easy, it's can compound to, again, that information coming up on screens that maybe we didn't intend to leave up on screens when we're walking away, and expensive mistakes if we're accidentally leaking that information or fat fingering an extra 1,000 times because individuals automated their own work. So anyway, digress into a whole lot of different areas.
We might need an episode number 2 on this. The last question that I have for you kind of goes back to something that you mentioned in your first response, and it's the idea of how intelligent automation can help companies that are growing through acquisition manage some of the activities that come along with that, but also kind of looking at how can we leverage intelligent automation to scale in life science, or especially when we're looking at like startup companies and the like. In the current environment, how can they grow using intelligent automation in ways that maybe we couldn't 10 years ago?
Yeah, so as you hit on, and I mentioned at the beginning, the merger and acquisition part is big, but let's take this from a slightly different direction. So if you look back a decade ago, start of 2011, there were about 100,000 registered studies on clinicaltrials.gov. If you jump ahead a decade to the start of this year, start of 2021, there's about 360,000 registered studies on clinicaltrials.gov. And in a real life scenario, if you take Celgene, for example, before they were acquired by Bristol Myers Squibb, the average number of clinical studies that they were doing was increasing by 20% year over year, but their headcount was only increasing by 4% year over year. So heck of a lot more work without a matching headcount. And intelligent automation can be a force multiplier in that scenario. There's a quote I use from Alice in Wonderland all the time in various different presentations, and I'll butcher it if I don't read it. It goes, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. And in the life sciences industry, if we use that Celgene example, you actually have to run 4 times as fast. So we need something else to help our people be able to keep up with that much data, process it, handle it accurately, and move forward. You got to do more with less and make sure that work is done right the first time. And again, intelligent automation can be a force multiplier for that, to aggregate data between, consolidated various different presentation layers. For example, just in the contact center alone, imagine one person has to deal with 20 different applications when you call them to help out with something, or to turn around and do the reverse of actually inputting data one time and then duplicating that data into many different systems. And, that's big, but it's a bit straightforward. Now let's factor in the intelligence factor. Remember where this space was at about a decade ago. I mean, the iPhone 4 was just being released. It was the first iPhone with a front-facing camera, and it'd break if you held it the wrong way. So now we have iPhones with 3 front-facing cameras and LiDAR to turn yourself into a 3D modeled chicken if you want to. I mean, this technology has taken a huge leap, even in the consumer space, and we can apply that to the commercial space. Just 2 years back, one of my colleagues and I, Jason Salmani, and I built an automation demo that was allowing for pill identification to be run using an image, and it would actually take a picture of a pill and it'd tell you what that medication was. And in fact, now 2 years after that, while that was just a demo at that point, 2 years after, there's a big systems implementer selling an application to do exactly that. And we've reached the level of trust of that type of technology for that accuracy to be at a commercial scale. Heck, half of clinical trials are still relying on paper documents. So we have the rise of much more intelligent OCR, ICR technologies over the last decade that also get into things like handwriting recognition that are using crowdsourced data samples. So technology is moving extremely fast. The technology accuracy is equally important. That's improving at an exponential rate, which is important, again, when we're dealing with PII, PHI, life and death types of situations here. We're training those intelligent automation solutions from aggregated cloud data sets. And then finally, I think probably the biggest change that everybody can see out there beyond my kind of diatribe on this stuff is we're not just using the term artificial intelligence anymore the way we were a decade ago. As soon as somebody comes to me and says, Josh, give me a use case for XYZ software plus intelligent automation or AI, and I start to describe a use case to them, they say, no, that's RPA plus a chatbot, or that's RPA plus a natural language processing. As soon as we define the case, now there's other words we're using instead of this replacement of this broad artificial intelligence magical marketing term. So that's a huge change that we're seeing within the market and defining what those actually look like. So hopefully that was helpful. I know this is probably a little on the longer side, but I'll pass it back to you, Emma.
I know the game of semantics within this industry is something that's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, because it is. Once everybody gets used to a term, used to a thought process, we rename it and we look towards something different, how we're going to talk about it. But at the end of the day, just like you were talking about, the ultimate goal of any of these tools coming into an organization, especially within life science, is to help you manage the parts that maybe humans aren't great at managing and can be better suited with a bot or some sort of technology aggregating data and helping you scale your business to do more with less. And so that's kind of the biggest takeaways that I've got from our conversation. And I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk with me. And a little behind the scenes for everybody, Josh has been wonderfully patient with me with all sorts of technical difficulties today. So an extra thank you for that. But I want to encourage everybody who isn't already connected with Josh to make your way over to his LinkedIn and reach out to him there. But thank you very much again for your time today, and have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thanks so much.
If you're looking for expert tips on how to get started with your transformation or looking to hone in on your approach, make sure that you subscribe to our channel to catch our weekly Digital Transformation Talk series, where we interview experts from around the world on how to make it happen.